I wanted to start very quickly with a story. And that story, or rather the picture that I want to paint for you, is a world in which pharmaceuticals are not available. It's a world in which the lithium-ion batteries that Elon Musk was talking about yesterday don't exist. Now, fortunately for all of us, that's not the world that we live in. We have pharmaceuticals, we have batteries, electric cars. Science has given us a lot of hope. But unfortunately, in many parts of government, and in politics particularly, that same dedication to rigor and science does not always exist. And so our vision for future government is one in which data, which I'm sure many groups are going to be talking about today, is at the very heart and soul of government. And in the process of putting data and the scientific method at the process of government, or in the institutions of government, we're going to be able to move government away from politics and towards policy. And I think that's something that's particularly relevant for people who live in the United States today. So here's the framework that we've come up with to kind of think about the idea of putting data at the heart of government. Government kind of has 4 key steps when it creates policy. It gathers data from its citizens through a variety of mechanisms, but elections are kind of the most important. It then goes ahead and designs policy, hopefully reflecting the will of the citizens. It then implements that policy, and in a really good government, it evaluates that policy with some degree of rigor. And at each of those steps, we want to be able to put data and advanced analytics at the core. So on that first step, kind of using data to inform public policy from the get-go, we've come up with a couple of interesting ideas in which data can be particularly useful and will become increasingly useful with time. A great example is with respect to crime. You see governments increasingly creating databases, geolocating where crimes happen, using predictive analytics to try to prevent the incidence of crime. It could also be useful in the generation and transmission of electricity, where, for example, you could see in the future utilities being able to better predict supply and demand of electricity. In the second phase of government, once you've sort of solicited information from the world, whether it's from citizens, from ambient sensors, you have to actually implement policy. And in the implementation of policy, there's a kind of a dialogue that happens with citizens, and you see an increasing use, and hopefully in the future, kind of a deeper use of applications that directly connect citizens to government, that democratize participation, that encourage ownership of all people, of all citizens in the policymaking process. The third piece, and arguably the area in which the most has to be done for governments, is in the evaluation of policy and the iterative process that should exist in government for creating increasingly successful policies. So today, governments by and large are relying on administrative household survey data in order to better understand what their citizens are doing. And that leads to a certain amount of quantitative methods being able to kind of guide the creation of policy. But at the end of the day, that's kind of a backwards-looking process. It has limited predictive abilities. And so what we see kind of looking forward is the opportunity to evaluate policy with very advanced sources of data, very advanced techniques, the kinds of techniques that Elon Musk talked about yesterday, things that are driving self-driving cars and so forth. So using Internet of Things and distributed sensors to collect data, analyze, and then predict the types of policies that will be successful, and also to very precisely measure their impact. You could also imagine a future that might be a bit more distant, in which technologies that are just coming onto the scene today, things like neural networks, are actually able to not only precisely determine the impact of a policy, but are actually able to pull from disparate data sets to create new policies that human policymakers may not have been able to come up with on their own. So we recognize that in this kind of utopian data-driven future, there's quite a few risks. We've listed a couple of them. I would highlight probably 2 or 3 in particular, one of which is how do you, as your government is increasingly driven by data, ensure that there's equity in the way that policies are created. And over-reliance on data without sensible kind of qualitative measures can mean that there's discrimination that's embedded in the system. There's also significant cybersecurity challenges, and I would also point out something that's probably very near and dear to people's hearts, which is how do you balance the public good with demands for privacy when you're considering collecting reams of data on citizens, processes, and things that are happening in an economy. And so on that note, we all recognize that many of these technologies are just beginning to be implemented in government today. But what we would emphasize is that governments need to put data at the core of all of their decision-making processes. And the way to do that is not only to build out the technical infrastructure to do that, which consists of sensors, applications that citizens can use, data warehouses that enable sharing across ministries, but also kind of bathe civil servants and politicians alike in fluency in data. And then finally, and perhaps the most important, educate your citizens around the importance of data in creating policies that, again, reflect the realities of the world rather than politics or ideology.